We begin in Europe, where the world's second-largest election concluded on Sunday. More than half of the eligible voters in 28 EU countries chose a national party to represent them in the European Parliament. The latest results show, some say, traditional centrists losing ground, while nationalists, populists, and environmentalists making gains. However, the overall balance has not changed. Before we go to the discussion about the election's significance, let's take a look at this backgrounder.
A surge of enthusiasm to have their say in the direction of the EU. More than 200 million EU citizens came out during the last few days to cast their ballot, marking this first time that voter turnout increased for the EU Parliament's election in the last 40 years. The result, while traditional centrist parties still hold most of the 751 seats in the Parliament, they lost their majority status. Nationalists, populists, and environmentalists have all made significant gains compared to 5 years ago. While they disagree on many issues, they will have more sway in shaping the EU's laws and budgets. And as voters vote for a single party from their own country in this election, the results are in effect also a referendum on domestic politics across the EU. In Germany, the Greens had a resounding victory, snatching second place from the far-right AfD, while Chancellor Merkel's centre-right alliance remains on top. In France, Marine Le Pen's rebranded National Rally pulled off a narrow victory over President Emmanuel Macron's centrist parties. Le Pen said the result confirmed the new nationalist globalist division in France. In Italy, the anti-immigration champion Matteo Salvini's party scored first place. In Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's Socialist Party swept victory. As Britain's ties with the EU remains in a painful limbo, British voters gave their biggest support to a party established earlier this year called the Brexit Party.
The Brexit Party, 950.
As the only directly elected EU body, a more fragmented EU Parliament suggests that consensus building will not get easier for the Union that was founded to maintain peace.
So how should we read the implications of the outcome for the EU Parliament elections? What about some of the key issues that the Parliament is going to be responsible for the near future? In our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at Renmin University. Sir, welcome to our program. Joining us in Paris, France, Jean Rouet, Chairman of the Bridge Tank. Thank you, sir. And also joining us from the country of Germany, in Berlin, we invited Paul Hackner, who is the author of the book Berlin Calling. Welcome as well. Let me go to you first, Mr. Rouet. Of course, the biggest talk is about how much the far right is eating away, shall we say, some of the previous territories of the central left and the central right. Now, the overall balance has not changed, but in France, it's a little bit different story.
Well, you're right, you mentioned that. In fact, we had a test vote, not just in France, but at the level of the whole of Europe. The test vote was about, do we want to go towards more Europe, further integration, or nationalism? So you're right that in some countries nationalism rose, but what is striking is that for the first time since 1979, when we had the first elections, well, the number of voters who've turned up has increased. So there was a strong motivation by the voters, in a sense, to say, yes, we want further Europe, we want more integration, you know. So the message is rather positive.
But I'm asking you about France specifically, Mr. Rouet, if you could directly answer my question. That is, the far right, Le Pen, for example, Ms. Le Pen and her party is gaining some ground, even though the overall European picture has remained the same. But in France, it's a little bit different.
Sure. No, you're right. I was talking for France as well, in the sense that the level of engagement of the voters has gone up. So you're right that Le Pen, which is the far right, has now come first, but by a very tiny difference, very tiny majority. If you take the total of the parties which are progressive. You have an overwhelming majority of French people who want further Europe. That's one thing. The second thing is that we know very well, that, and we've had this experience in the past, that whenever the people from the far right, they have MPs, members of parliament elected, those MPs just don't turn out to the parliament and just don't do their jobs. So they are there to pretend to try and derail, but not to bring anything constructive or disruptive. You know, it's inefficient.
Interesting. Mr. Hucknall, do you have the same views about what's going on with the far right? Do they really pose as a threat now to the central left and central right together?
Well, I mean, what we saw across Europe was indeed an increase in far-right Eurosceptic parties. They gained, but much less than everybody thought.
Yes.
I think the real message here, I think that the real victor of this election was actually the European Union itself. You know, over 75% of the people who voted for pro-EU parties. In Germany, it was over 90%. The far right got a very small vote here, well, 10%, which was less than it got in the elections 2 years ago. You know, we're looking at a completely different picture now in the European Union. We're looking at a European Union that's, you're always using words like fragmented, but in fact it's more pluralistic. The Greens, for example, did very well in Germany, with nearly 21% of the vote. So they're going to be bringing in a different dynamic into the EU Parliament. All in all, I think it was really a positive vote in many ways. You had the turnout, you had a record number of young people voting, and they were voting for parties that were particularly pro-European and pro-integration.
Yeah.
So I think actually that there are a lot of good could come from this vote.
Right. Professor
I don't
Wang,
think it's that the right wing is going to be dominating in the European Union.
Professor Wang, earlier, of course, the right wings were having much louder voice in the media. Of course, this has a lot to do with the nature of how media works these days. Sometimes things are being portrayed out of proportion. So, Professor Wang, as an analyst yourself, when you seriously and honestly look at the numbers that are coming out today about the European parliamentary elections, what do you make of the real picture in Europe, particularly people who support the European Union, or at least continuation of this ongoing process, and those who are fundamentally against the idea, Professor Wang?
Well, definitely European integration will be moved further, but more difficult. Even there are pro-European integration, but in a different reason, different scenario. Like the Green Party, I think increased in Germany and Scandinavia, and then make the European Union more focused on the climate change and the budget. You know, because the European Parliament. If you put more the emphasis on the industrial policy reform, that's more difficult. So we still worry about this. The first test, I think, is the president of the European Commission. That is difficult to maybe. It's not just traditionally. But this time, I think, thanks for the youth voters who under the Brexit and the right wing, and then I think more than 50% of the voting rate is very high, I think.
Right. Since you talk about Brexit, Mr. Hucknall, let me go to you about that. You know, because earlier the Brexit should happen, however, it didn't. Therefore, the UK still sent its parliamentary delegation, and now they still have candidates for the parliamentary elections. However, it's expected that probably in the middle of the next 4 to 5 years in which this parliament will be serving its duties, that the UK will leave the EU, possibly. Therefore, what about the seat numbers that are now supposed to be going to the British parliamentarians? Where are they going to after this? And what would that mean for the overall balance that we're talking about, sir? Go ahead.
I think that's a good question. I mean, exactly what's going to happen with the seats and the number of seats and how they're going to be reordered or whatever, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. But one thing that we can say is that we see this big surge. We saw the Brexit Party, you know, getting over 24 representatives, and of course they are counted in with the Eurosceptics. But they will, we think, most probably over the next couple of years, when Brexit happens, they will leave. So in a way, you know, as the right wing we talked about, you know, it surged a bit. it's had some gains, but I think those gains will actually look like a lot less when the Brits and the Brexit Party withdraw from the European Union and then the European Parliament too, and we have to keep that in mind.
Interesting. But, you know, many say the painstaking Brexit process of the UK really has put the European continent to a second thought, particularly those voters who are coming into the polls over the past parliamentary election. Mr. Rouet, about that, how much do you think, really, from your perspective, really the Brexit has been meaning politically for this year's parliamentary election of the EU?
You mean out of the Brexit?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I think the Brexit has disrupted the EU slightly, but it has disrupted the UK mostly. So I would tend to converge with what my colleague from Berlin said, that in a sense this has been a wake-up call for the institutions in Brussels. This has been a wake-up call for the Parliament. The Parliament has worked very hard under Mr. Juncker for social nets for the workers and especially the migrant workers across Europe. So I think the initial disturbance has served positively in the end. I will also subscribe to what my colleague in Berlin said, that the extreme right has been contained in a sense, and if you remove all those MPs from Britain who are from the extreme right, the share of the extreme right at the European level is even less. So we'll go for a coalition government, and a coalition government at this stage of building of the EU is the best to represent majority of the people, you know?
Yes. And now we are joined by Ian Beck, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Of course, there's no better person to go to about that answer concerning the UK and the possible role UK is likely to play in future Parliament of the EU. So, Professor, the hard Brexiters this time, what do you think about their performance overall vis-a-vis their rhetorics?
Well, the Brexit Party is the one that has done very well in this election in the UK, not the UK Independence Party, which was the previous hard right. I would say the Brexit Party, led by Nigel Farage, is not as extreme as UKIP, which is now replaced. And it's also significant to add up the votes cast for three different Remain parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Nationalists and the Greens in the UK, as well as the small number who voted for the Change UK party. That's the other new party that was created by defectors from the Labour and Conservative parties. If you add them up, they secured even more votes than the new Brexit party. And this suggests that the division in British politics is still where it was before, except that I think on the arithmetic of this, you see more going towards the collection of Remain parties than going towards the narrow band of Brexit parties. So this suggests a tilt towards Remain, which is also consistent with more young people voting.
Yeah. Now, since we talk about the result so far, looking at the numbers, how it's breaking up in different political forces, Professor Wang, let me ask you about this, because there are a lot of things that this European Parliament is going to be significant for. Of course, I mean, this is a huge body, it could be a lot of bureaucracy, and it's not necessarily going to be responsible for all the legislations and the decisions of the European Union, because there's European Commission to do that. However, it's responsible for a lot of things. Just some information for our viewers. The budget, they have to approve, the European Parliament, right? And also the trade policy. If you look at the trade disputes and the trade discussions and debates. And meanwhile, who is going to be the European Commissioner? That is going to be voted eventually and approved by this European Parliament at this critical juncture. So, Professor Wang, what do you think the critical juncture mean? Is this European Parliament going to be divided by national interests? Or is it going to be divided by political fractions?
I think both. Firstly,
That's making things really complicated. Well, it's already complicated anyway.
but national party is actually rising, but definitely there was sovereignty, more focus on sovereignty. Given that, like in Hungary, the Orban current prime minister, the party, they have more than 50% of the voters. So it's more brave against any like refugees and or the other policies. Yeah. And at the same time, also difficult for the majority parties alliance to control the decision. So it's more override. They can more should press the Commission to negotiate like the FTA or with the other parties, and also the budget, as you mentioned, to invest in more climate change and innovation, and make the European Union. It's hard to catch up with like in AI, the United States and China. So that's in the long term definitely is not good for the competitive advantage of the European economy.
I see. Professor Begg, if you look at the makeup of the European Parliament, okay, Germany got the most seats because it's by population proportion, right? And then France, and then Italy, and then some of the other countries as well. So do you think eventually, particularly on trade, let's just give an example, is it going to be divided by national interests? These countries could be having very different national interests because it could be trade discussions, it could be China's Belt and Road initiatives, which different capitals have very different views. It's also related to trade, infrastructure. It could also be a cross-Pacific, or rather cross-Atlantic relationship now, very important with the United States. The immigration issues, very important, and very different capitals think different ways. So, Professor Begg, what about that? By capitals or by political subscriptions?
I think it's going to be predominantly now by political affiliations, because there are now 4 significant, if you like, centrist or pro-European blocs in the European Parliament. The centre-right, EPP, the centre-left, Socialists and Democrats, the Greens, and the very centrist ALDE, Liberal Party. And they collectively have something like 60% of the parliamentary seats. That means they can set the agenda on things like the form of trade, like who they want to be the next officers of the European Commission, and setting the EU budget, which they do on the expenditure side. So on all these things, I think it's fair to say that the country-specific demands coming from nationalist entities in Italy or France or somewhere else are going to lose out in this process. And indeed, it may even force the pro-European parties to think European rather than nationally in the way they've not done before. I think that could be one of the key lessons from this European Parliament election.
Fascinating stuff. Mr. Hockner, so do you agree with that?
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Yes, I do, but I'm a little bit surprised in their discussion so far we haven't mentioned climate change. You know, over the past decades, the European Union's raison d'etre of peace and security in post-war Europe has failed to inspire and excite younger generations as it had older ones in the past. And the European Union has been desperately looking for a new cause, something to inspire it, something to bring along young people. And I think that they found it now. It's climate change. It's clear that the young people who took to the streets, 1.6 million young people took to the streets last Friday and skipped school to demonstrate for more climate protection. All of the opinion polls in Europe show 98% of Europeans, unlike my fellow Americans, believe that climate change is real, that it's man-made, and that something can be done about it. Exit polls also show that in France and Germany, for example, climate change was the highest concern of voters, more so than migration. And even in countries where migration or bread and butter issues of jobs or economy were on the line, they felt that climate change was very important.
And therefore, there's no division that we are talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
What we are talking about here is the danger of divisions here. The danger of division, why a parliament
No, there's a
might
huge
be having
consensus on
challenges, but
climate
you are
change.
talking about all the common grounds. I guess if the parliament is really for the common ground and they have already agreed upon, there's no difficulty for them to come up with legislation or at least approve the legislation regarding to climate change. Let's see what's going to happen, whether it's only rhetoric or it's going to be real action. About the division, trade will be a big one because there are different countries having very different agendas. Germany, for example, France, of course, have different concerns. Mr. Ruette, Italy pretty much work with China on the so-called third-party development, the Belt and Road Initiative. All these are fascinating branches of the trade issue, not to mention the big trade thing, which is between the EU and the United States regarding the cars and many other issues. So, Mr. Ruette, your thought about this European Parliament, what does it mean for trade?
You know, I think that's why we have a legislative, which is the parliament, and an executive, which is the commission.
Yes.
You're pretty right. We have some tough decisions to make in the future. There will be division. But the beauty of it is that half of the division will be inside the commission, will be from chancelleries to chancelleries. No doubt it will be party-wise, the repartition of power, but at the time of nominating the commissioners, the chancelleries, the main capitals of the European countries will throw their weight in the balance. So after we form the commission, the commission will evolve consensus that will be presented to the parliament. And I think that on the tough subjects, this will come, the initiative will come from the commission with a bit of consensus, but still will be discussed and disputed in the parliament. And I think it's rather for the consensual subject that the initiative will come from the parliament. You know, so the tough problems from to the commission and the consensus to the parliament. But
Professor
all
Wang?
this being said, it's already a progress, and it's good a surprise.
Okay, interesting. Professor Wang, do you think the commission will be able to solve all the problems while going to the parliament? Things will be peaceful? Or there's likely to be also some bitter fights as we speak about trade issues, about immigration issues, about specific budgets. Where does it go proportion-wise? Professor Wang.
Well, all the issues are linked together. Even about the trade, about the climate change definitely put very important influence on that negotiation with other external forces. And also the regional gaps also. You know, the Green Party is rising only in Germany, in the North Europe, but even in the South and Eastern European countries, they are not so much. So the also Eastern and West and North and South, so the gap, the differences. So in the future, any decision making is more difficult either in the Parliament and also in the Commission.
Of course, Professor Begg, the next 4 years in which the Parliament is going to function will be critical years for a lot of global issues and for the future of the EU about its role in the world. Professor Begg, do you think this current Parliament will be bringing us more consensus or likely to be much more debate? Even the Commission will play a key role in decision-making process.
Well, the Parliament, as a result of these elections yesterday, is more fragmented than it was previously. And it does mean that the two core groups, the Socialists and Democrats, the centre-left, and the EPP, the centre-right, can no longer dominate the agenda the way they used to in the past. That means they're going to have to bargain with and compromise with the other parties, issue by issue. In the European system, it's the European Commission, the executive, which has the right of initiative, the right to put things on the table, and the Parliament only comes in later to decide on them in collaboration with the countries, the member states. So there is this quite complicated decision-making process. I think we need to wait to see what individuals and are named both for the presidency of the Commission and the individual commissioner jobs to know what their priorities will be. And I think that might even be centre-left.
Okay, Ian Begg, Paul Hagnoth, and also Mr. Joe Ruette, Wang Yiwei. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.